This week, President Biden is hosting more than 100 countries for what's being called a democracy summit. The White House hopes it can strengthen democracy and human rights abroad while defending against authoritarianism and corruption. But the last few years have shown some flaws in the democratic system right here in the US. Of course, there are the recent examples, from politicized claims of fraud in the 2020 election to a violent election response that threatened the seat of US democracy itself on January 6th. But there are also less in-your-face flaws in US democracy that are far from figured out. Take redistricting, which is happening now following last year's census. States are redrawing the boundaries of districts for state legislatures and Congress, and as it often does, it's leading to accusations of gerrymandering. As a refresher, gerrymandering refers to the practice of drawing district lines to favor one party or group. It's a process that can lead to manipulating how large or how representative districts are. Like if there are 50 people and 5 districts for them, split 60-40 by party. You could split people up by representing the split perfectly, or you can gerrymander districts so that the minority is always kept in the minority and never has representation. You can also gerrymander districts by carefully chopping up the majority votes in such a way that the minority actually ends up with more representation despite being a smaller part of the population. In real life, it can lead to some very strange looking districts meant to tie together communities with similar politics or demographics. Michael Kang, a law professor at Northwestern University and a redistricting expert, says that regardless of the shape, gerrymandering comes down to who's drawing the lines.
There are some gerrymanders that are more obvious, sometimes visually obvious because of the shape of the districts. There are some gerrymanders that are more extreme in terms of the effects they have. But I think anytime you give the job of drawing district lines to people with partisan and political incentives, they will do that job with those goals in mind.
While gerrymandering has been done across party lines, the numbers show Republicans tend to benefit a lot from it. In recent congressional election cycles, it's been common for Republicans to win more seats than their national popular vote share. And an AP analysis found that ahead of next year's midterms, Republicans have the biggest redistricting edge in decades. It comes as GOP officials across the country have been committed to resetting rules that also happen to have the effect of helping them protect their control, like strict voting laws that often make it tougher for minority communities to vote, state legislatures taking powers away from Democratic governors, and accusations of fraud meant to undermine wins by Democrats. And they've been in control of redistricting in more states, including many large competitive ones like North Carolina, Texas, Ohio, and Georgia. All of those states have seen or are expected to see lawsuits challenging the new maps. On Monday, the Justice Department announced it is suing Texas over its redistricting, alleging it unfairly weakens the voting power of Black and Latino residents. At the same time, other states have tried to limit gerrymandering. But while some states have taken the step of adopting redistricting commissions, they're not always totally independent. They're often still made up of political officials, and we're only seeing them in a handful of states, most of which are very blue. Now, you may be wondering, how is any of this legal? And what's being done about it? Democrats have proposed a voting rights bill in Congress that would ban partisan gerrymandering and set up a new legal standard for judges to use that would speed up court battles that often take years. Their legislation is still pending in Congress. Attorney Yuri Redinsky at the nonpartisan Brennan Center for Justice, which advocates for redistricting reform, says it could be a major tool to limit gerrymanders.
The test really looks at how past elections would play out under the new maps and what the expectation is in terms of the partisan outcomes that are possible. The goal is to prevent states without a compelling justification, without sufficient reason for doing so, for drawing maps that give one party an advantage beyond a certain threshold.
Additionally, key provisions of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 have been weakened in recent years by court decisions. The law still covers redistricting with regards to race, but adding further to the legal mess, it also says race should be considered if it means creating fairer representation.
There is still part of the Voting Rights Act that prevents the state from engaging in redistricting that's dilutive of minority voting strength. And then there's in addition another body of law called Shaw versus Reno which regulates racial gerrymandering, which says essentially, if you go too far in considering race, then we're going to strike it down. So you still have these kind of competing constitutional imperatives when it comes to racial gerrymandering and the drawing of race-conscious districts.
It's a point raised by Republicans drawing the lines this year in North Carolina, who say they didn't consider racial or partisan data, but are facing accusations from Democrats that the lines are drawn unfairly. The state went narrowly to Donald Trump over Joe Biden in 2020, and the state is pretty evenly split between Democrats and Republicans, with the last 4 presidential elections in the state all coming down to 4 points or less. But the state's new congressional map is expected to give Republicans 10 congressional seats and just 4 for Democrats. And it's not just about having seats and votes line up.
The thing we should really be thinking about is responsiveness. Is that if we have maps which are not responsive to changing political opinions, because political opinions change. Just look at North Carolina, it's a purple state. It swings in the 2 directions across different elections across a decade. That's been going on for decades. So if when those political opinions in the state at the electorate level change, if somebody's feet are not being held to the fire because of those changes, then we really have a problem with our democracy.
Duke University math professor Jonathan Mattingly has spent most of the last decade analyzing redistricting in North Carolina. His research used an algorithm to build a sample of maps to compare potentially gerrymandered maps against. And he found that even when you factor in different political climates and how voters are distributed across the state, the maps often don't respond to what voters want.
We can benchmark what should have happened or what we would have expected to happen in a sequence of different votes under different political climates, right? So, maps act differently in different political climates. So there's not just one analysis. You have to look at different political climates. And you see that these maps under some political climates that are very typical in North Carolina, they act in an incredibly biased way.
North Carolina's maps have been in the news before. It's about to have its 4th set of congressional maps in a decade after it resets its maps twice amid court challenges about alleged gerrymandering on both partisan and racial lines. In 2019, the Supreme Court issued a ruling on North Carolina's maps that might have major consequences for redistricting this year. They said that drawing maps on political lines isn't an issue for federal courts to rule on. That takes away a major legal path for voting rights and anti-gerrymandering advocates to challenge maps. But state courts can still consider lawsuits that challenge maps for being too partisan. And now, analysts are working to figure out which maps are worth challenging. With more open source data and more technology, researchers have been able to analyze redistricting maps to see how fairly or unfairly they represent voters. Like in Colorado, professors there analyzed their state's map and found it wasn't particularly unfair to either party. And in North Carolina, mathematicians have joined a lawsuit challenging the state's new maps. It's a growing front in legal battles across the country as political scientists, law professors, and mathematicians work together to figure out how to quantify gerrymandering. Our next guest has done just that. Eric Mcgee is a senior fellow at the Public Policy Institute of California. He co-created the efficiency gap, a way of calculating just how much partisan gerrymandering is happening in a given district or state. The metric has been used in cases in multiple states, including my home state, North Carolina, and Wisconsin, and has been used in arguments before the Supreme Court. Eric Mcgee, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, glad to be here.
So let's start with this. Off the top, can you explain to our viewers how the efficiency gap works and how it tells us about gerrymandering?
The way that map makers on one party or the other try to bias things in their favor is by ensuring that they win their seats as efficiently as possible. And what do I mean by efficiency? Well, they win it by a small margin so that they don't have a lot of supporters who are in that district who aren't contributing to a win. So if you win a seat by a very large margin, a lot of those supporters of your party could have been moved to a different district to help you win that district too. So what the efficiency gap does is it just basically is a way of tallying up those sort of inefficient votes, if you will, and coming up with a summary measure of how many there are on each side and what the partisan balance of those inefficient votes is.
I'd like to know what other mathematical or quantitative factors have we seen used to actually measure gerrymandering?
I think it falls into sort of two camps. One is measures that try to get at this efficiency concept that I was talking about in one respect or another. And then you have a whole different set of approaches, which really looks not so much at what the balance of efficiency is between the parties, but whether there was an intent to produce that imbalance. Because you can actually have an imbalance of efficiency based on where people live. So what they want to know is, were the people drawing the lines just drawing them to try and satisfy some other criteria, like say this compactness stuff? Were they trying to avoid splitting cities and counties? Were they trying to satisfy the Voting Rights Act for minority rights representation? That kind of thing. It involves asking a computer to calculate millions of maps, to draw millions of maps. Then you'd see, okay, how far outside of the norm of these millions of maps is the one that we actually have in front of us. And that'll give you some sense of what perhaps the intent was when somebody was drawing the map.
I'm thinking, what do all these numbers and calculations mean for the future of gerrymandering itself?
Right now, there's no sort of federal legal angle for using any of these metrics to try and strike down gerrymandering. Some of these approaches are embedded in this proposed voting rights law that the Democrats are trying to push through Congress. Right now, that thing is totally tied up in the Senate. It can't get the 60 votes it needs to break a filibuster, so it's not going anywhere right now. So that kind of leaves the federal option, the Washington, D.C. option, kind of barren. That doesn't mean that there aren't some uses for these metrics. For instance, a number of states have fairness provisions. And so there are avenues for lawsuits and for putting pressure on the people drawing the lines in those states.
Eric Mcgee is a senior fellow at the Public Policy Institute of California. Thank you so much for joining us, my man.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.